stuff. Okay. So the very first thing you do is you choose a topic. So if you're going to write a paper on crime and punishment, which you had to, and you're going to have to rewrite. So let's go through this process. You need to choose a topic. For our purposes, I chose a topic for you, and it was existentialism. And I did, a little prep work for that, and I showed you what existentialism was, and we didn't get really into it. We didn't read other existential texts, but we had this kind of overarching view of what our topic was about, right? Then you want to start asking some basic questions about that. And we started doing that when we were talking about what you guys believed. So when I gave you all the information about existentialism, and then I would say, okay, well, do you think that life is nauseous? Or do you think that hell is other people, et cetera? And we had this conversation about some of these basic questions. And I think as we were talking about the basic questions, more questions started to arise. Like, okay, if you do or do not think life is nauseous, we still need to figure out what does that mean. And so we asked questions about what makes you nauseous. You remember this? And we were talking about like motion sickness or social anxiety or all different situations where food poisoning where you could potentially get nauseous, right? And then we were starting to like narrow down our questions based on that. So it's all well and good to start with something sort of wide and far-reaching, like, are you an existentialist? Does life make you nauseous, etc.? But you're trying to narrow that down, and we're going to narrow it down into a single question.
What is existentialism?
Yeah, and for this one, it was like, is this book existentialist? After all of that prep work of trying to figure out if we are existentialists and what that actually means, I wanted to ask, can we apply this to the book? And that's a great question to start with, but it is still quite broad. I'm still thinking about all those tenets of existentialism and whether or not they apply to this book. And that's going to be really hard to write about in this length of papers I make you write, which is like at most 3 pages. That you can't cover if a book is existentialist in 3 pages. It's really not possible if you're doing a good job. So then you've got to complicate the question and narrow it. Complicate and narrow the question. And that's when we wrote all of those questions up on the board about what would make it existentialist. Does this book believe in God? Is this book, does this book think that you can ever know other people? Does it think joy is possible? Can you take full responsibility for your actions, et cetera, et cetera? And you guys chose the avenues that you were going to go with thinking about it. So ultimately, the question that I want to choose for our discussion today is, does this book believe in a benevolent God? Let's say benevolent and caring God. And if so, what is the use of believing in him?
It's just like, does it believe in God, but a benevolent and caring God?
Right, exactly.
Does pose the question of, is the God they're trying to convey to you common?
Yes, exactly.
Or are they working for their own purpose?
Absolutely, exactly. So I'm putting it in those more narrow terms, mostly to challenge myself as a writer, because I do think that does the book believe in God leaves it kind of broad enough where that essay might be a little bit more easy to write than going more narrow. And you're not looking for essays that are easy to write. I mean, it'd be nice if they were, but ultimately you get a good grade on the AP test, and we will be talking more about that AP test on Friday, but you get a better grade if you're saying something unique and interesting and a little bit just not the cliche. And so you're trying to avoid writing the paper that's the easiest paper to write, and instead you're trying to write the one that's the most interesting to write. And because we're doing this together, I'm forcing you to have my interest. This is my interest in the book. You could choose whatever avenue you wanted to, as long as it was like narrow. Okay, so this is where we kind of got to in that very first prompt you did for this class where you were writing questions. That's the process. You have the topic, you ask some basic questions, you start to narrow it down, and then you complicate that question. All right. Now is when you speculate about the answer. And I think, yeah, last class, when you had all of those different questions that you were thinking about, you started by speculating about the answer. You chose a question and you said, okay, does this book believe in free will? And then in your partners, you were talking, well, I kind of think it does sometimes and it doesn't other times. And you're sort of starting to speculate about what the answer to the question is. From that speculation, though, you need to find direct evidence. I think that too many students speculate about the answer and then start writing without finding the evidence first. And it's really important to find that evidence first, because hopefully that is going to add more nuance and specificity to your answer to the question. If you start here and you write your thesis statement without looking at the evidence carefully, you're going to have a pretty broad thesis statement, and we don't want to do that. So this is all before you start writing the paper. You're finding the evidence. You've found passages. Then you are close reading the evidence, and this is what we have been practicing so far in this class. Like, you remember when we put up the first sentence from the book, and I made you look up the word sultry and like talk about his little room and all of that. That was close reading. You do that with the evidence that you find that you think is going to answer the question, and from there you're going to be able to refine that answer. And we're going to now call the answer the theme. A theme equals an answer to the question. Okay, so that means, does this book believe in a benevolent, caring God? And if so, what is the use of believing in him? The answer can't be existentialism.
He's not.
Right? It can't just be a one-word answer. A theme is not a topic. There's differences between a topic and a theme. A theme is the answer to the question that you are posing. And you're doing that from the book's point of view. So I'm going to say book's answer to the question that you are posing. I don't know what Dostoevsky believed. Actually, I mean, I know he believed in God because that's like really well recorded, but let's pretend I don't know anything about Dostoevsky. On the test, you're going to have passages from authors that you've never heard of before. So I don't know anything about his personal beliefs. It doesn't matter to me. I mean, I'm interested, but for these purposes, it doesn't matter. What you're trying to answer is what the book thinks. And if that ends up different than what you know Dostoevsky thought, that's fine. You have the power as a reader to derive your own meaning from the text. I always get pushback from students on this particular issue where, like, you know, it's English teachery stuff. Right now we're talking about the Scarlet Letter. I don't know if you remember talking about the Scarlet Letter, but the very first chapter of Scarlet Letter, I made my class spend 3 class periods on it. And it's they hate me for it. Right about this time of the year, they're like starting to question their decisions to stay in the class. And the classes are so big, I don't mind if they decide to leave because we're focusing too much on the prison door. But basically we spent 3 class periods talking about the prison door and what the symbolism of the door means. And by the 3rd class period, they're all just saying, it's just a door. Like, get over it. It is a door to a prison. You know, it maybe has a little bit of significance, but not so much that you're bringing to it. But that, to me, I'm like, it doesn't matter if Hawthorne was saying that it was just a door. I don't think he was, but it doesn't matter what his intentions were. What mattered is that he chose to use this word in describing the prison door. And as a reader, I can talk about that word for a whole class period. We can talk about the word throng and what that means for the whole class period, right? So you're looking for the book's answers to the question, just to be very clear. That means that you're not in these papers going to have much information about Dostoevsky. You can totally give some context to it if you want to. That's stuff for the intro, but you're not saying that, well, Dostoevsky believes in a kind, benevolent God, so that means that this book does, because that's not necessarily true. All right, so you've refined the theme. You come up with the answer to the question. That's what we're going to be working on today, is coming up with that answer. And then you notice patterns in the language, or you take note of patterns. So you take these passages that you found, the evidence, and you're looking for patterns in the imagery or in the narration style or in the nouns and adjectives. And we'll go through all of the different things you can look for when you're looking for patterns. But ultimately, the stronger papers aren't going to be just saying, oh, it uses the word sultry once and I can write a paragraph about sultry. The stronger paragraphs, we're going to see that it uses language like sultry, like language that is talking about both the like seductive quality of violence, but also the like dangerous, guilty side of violence. And you're trying to look for those patterns. Then you can write a whole paragraph about a certain pattern, and that becomes really strong evidence because it didn't just exist once, it exists throughout the book. That's what you're looking for. And then last, you write your thesis, and this is when you actually start writing your paper. So all this is prep work to get you here. Here's where you write your thesis, and the thesis is the theme or the answer to the question plus the patterns. So here's the answer. Yes, I'm just randomly choosing one. Yes, this book believes in a kind of benevolent God. And we know this because we see the way that Sonia is, praised so highly in the book, and she believes in a kind, benevolent God. And by the end, we see that Raskolnikov has accepted that, and that's how we know. So it's a comment about the theme, or the thesis statement is the theme plus the literary techniques that are used to create that theme. And that's the whole process before you start writing. And then you have to actually write the thing. But if you've done all of this work ahead of time, writing the paper is actually simple. This is the hard part of writing the paper. Actually, I'm going to say these two. That's the hard part of writing the paper. Actually, writing the paper is just taking the observations you made here and formalizing them in a way that readers can actually understand your own thought process. But hopefully, you've got your ideas down before you even start writing. Any questions so far? Okay, this is probably something you've been doing in English class all along, maybe with a little bit of variation. Like this is what all literary analyses are made of. But I find it useful to just like put the steps down on paper so that if I feel like I'm like, my writing is suffering, sometimes I'll look at the steps and I'll see where I am missing attention. Like maybe I'm not speculating enough before I actually find the evidence. And so it's hard for me to find the evidence. Or maybe I am finding the evidence and then I'm skipping right to the theme and not doing the work of close reading. But if you follow all these steps, then the writing actually becomes a lot easier. So let's follow the steps together. All right. So we've got my question, we've got my topic. Let's start there. We need to find, let's speculate about the answer. Let's speculate for a second. I know we ended class this way, talking about whether the book believes in God. So let's continue with that discussion. What do you think? Informally, do you think that this book thinks that there is a God? Okay, you feel like, yes, this book has like faith. Why do you think so?
Because the epilogue kind of is that because like God
Okay, cool. So that's actually been some people's criticism of the epilogue. I don't know if I mentioned that in here, that it wraps everything up into a little bow, but you're saying like God is so present in that epilogue that it feels like the book is saying that through God there can be resolution. Things can be wrapped up in a little bow. Well, that's okay, but the book does. The book likes itself.
I like
That's a weird way of looking at that. You like the end wrapped up in a bow?
Okay, so I like endings that leave a little bit of like hope for the future. Like it didn't like wrap it up all the way. It left speculation of would he improve in those years? Would he actually follow through on his goals, because we've kind of seen Raskolnikov be a bit flighty in his decisions, and just sort of like the hope.
Yeah.
Which I think for some people may not be what they're looking for in a book. But I just kind of enjoy that. Like we went through all of this struggle, all of this.
Let's see that there was a reason.
Trauma.
Right.
And now we can see that even you can find hope and joy, even if you've done the worst crime.
And do you agree that it's finding that hope and joy in God?
I do believe that even if there isn't a God presented in the film, which I do believe there is, I think as God of God finds hope in turning to people who do believe.
Okay. And that's a really good distinction that we should start to speculate about. Does the book believe in God, or does the book believe in people who believe in God? And I think that's a really strong distinction. Asher?
I'd say that they're like, Sonia believes in God, and that makes her a really humble character, but there are also other characters who believe God and they don't get any better for it. Like Elizaveta, she was the one who like gave Sonia her cross and stuff, and it never helped her. She like, her fate was still the same.
Right. Okay. So, and we talked last time about how Sonia was like, no, God would not let this thing happen, and then it ends up happening. So to characters who believe in God, who don't believe in God, either way, they can be kind of cut down by life. So the book maybe is not believing that God is all merciful to anyone who believes in him, or who he's not. Just because you believe in God doesn't mean you're going to have a great life, kind of idea. Any other thoughts about what the book believes about? Yeah,
I know we talked about this last time, but the way social media allows safe children from terrible fate after cutting size is.
Does that say that like that God has some kind of like purpose, that that life has some kind of purpose, that God is sort of like moving the chess pieces in a way?
I think of that.
Okay, so the fact that something awful or something great can come from something awful seems to be proof that the book is giving us that there's at least some kind of benevolent force to the universe. Okay, any other ideas about it? Yeah.
I think in this book, God is just sort of like letting things happen and nudging it. Like, I don't believe God plays a significant in the lives of these people, and just sort of like, he just nudges it all, just uses the people around.
Okay, good. So we've got the idea of nudging. We've got the idea of a kind, benevolent God. And we've got this idea that it's people who who believe in God, but people who find some sort of humility that the book believes in, not necessarily a God. So good speculation. Let's actually look at the evidence. I'm going to say that the evidence we want to look for this question is in the epilogue. And the epilogue deals with kind of two main tracks towards justice. The epilogue is talking about the justice that comes from the law, and it's talking about the justice that comes from God, or a belief in God. So I kind of did some brainstorming on this before we actually look at it and what that actually looks like. All right, so in a court, so justice according to the law, you've got the motivation leads to a crime. Then it leads to like an investigation of the crime in which you finally assign blame. And then it leads to assigning punishment. And this is the path to justice that the legal system sees. And through assigning punishment, you get kind of satisfaction for the victims. That's part of what we talk about a lot. It is why the victims of a crime can be present at an execution, or that they can be in court and actually like face the person who was the perpetrator. It's because through this assigning punishment, you're supposed to get a sense of like retribution a little bit, right? But then it also protects us from criminals. So through this process, part of justice is to kind of remove the criminal from society. And we could think about the justice for the criminal too. We could think about an idea of rehabilitation. Maybe in other places, but the gulags in Russia were not necessarily meant as places of rehabilitation. That's not the way that they were necessarily seen. I would argue our prisons too, not necessarily seen as systems of rehabilitation, maybe ideally, but not really in practice. Okay, so that's like the legal system, right? I think God's justice works much differently than that. So under a kind of Christian idea of God's justice, you would have, what am I looking for here? kind of map this out a little bit differently. So you'd have the motivation, you would have the crime, but God knows who has committed the crime. If God is all-knowing and all-powerful, he knows who has committed the crime. And suddenly the system for justice becomes far more personal to the criminal. It's not necessarily about these things. It is more about the criminal reforming or the criminal receiving redemption. There we go, the criminal receiving redemption, right? So you've got motivation, you've got a crime, and then you are looking for assigning personal blame, which we're going to call guilt. You have to feel sorry for your sins. We can say crime is actually kind of sin here. Motivation is kind of temptation. And from there, assigning blame, you would take personal responsibility for blame. All right, and these kind of go together, right? And then from there, you would be looking for a kind of religious punishment. Oof. So in Catholicism, say your Hail Marys. In Mormonism, there's different ways to get that kind of religious punishment. In every religion, they have ways of imagining like the punishment that is appropriate for the sin, right? But the goal is different. The goal for these things is for personal redemption and salvation. And in this system, it doesn't seem to be that much about the victims of the crime. It is more about the personal salvation of the sinner, right? And I think in this epilogue, it is setting up both of these things and thinking about how to get redemption in both of these systems. Is it possible for Raskolnikov to be saved through law, or is it possible for him to be saved through God? Neither or both. So at the beginning of the epilogue, turn to the epilogue with me. So this was my speculation about the answer. This is what I'm going through. Yeah. Yes, there's books right there on the top of the Tupperware if you need one. Yes. That's so far away though. Go fast. How far away is your locker? Oh no. Okay, yeah, go fast. Get that heart rate up. Okay. Yeah. All right. So it's just at the very beginning of the epilogue when it deals with legal justice. I like the way they talk about it. So it's in the big middle of that giant, well, let's look at the beginning of the giant paragraph, the second paragraph. And I'm just going to read from mine. If you have any interesting differences in your translation, feel free to tell me about them. So mine says, the legal proceedings had passed off without any great difficulty. The criminal had firmly, exactly, and clearly reaffirmed his statement, so his confession, neither confusing the circumstances nor extenuating them in his own interest, neither misrepresenting the facts nor forgetting the smallest particular. He described the murder in minute detail, explained the mystery of the pledge, the piece of wood and its strip of metal, which was found in the dead woman's hand, told how he had taken the keys from the body, and gave a description of the keys, the trunk, and its contents. He even enumerated some of the objects which were lying in it. So he's telling all of the details. Yes?
My translation is way different.
Same.
Yeah, I'm sure. So when 1 second. So it's like he's telling all of the details of the crime, and this is part of confession so that they know that he actually committed the crime. Because remember, there's that false confessor. I know this from watching lots of Law and Order. There's always false confessors who want to be blamed for the events, but the police hold back details so that they know when the real criminal comes forth, right? That's kind of what he's doing here, proving that he's responsible. Is there anything interesting in the way that yours has translated it? Mine's all about how easy it was, the trial was. Is that what yours is about?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So mine says it's passed off without any great difficulty. What's the first sentence of your translation?
There had been no difficulty about his trial.
Little difficulty about his trial. Okay, cool. What I think is so interesting in all of our translations, then, it doesn't say the trial was easy. It says there was no difficulty. Why do you think it would choose to do it that way? Rather than say, trial passed off, it was very easy, this trial. Instead, it's saying there was an absence of difficulty to this trial. Audrey?
it's kind of like a trial isn't an easy thing to do in the first place. So it's kind of like being the tallest dwarf. you know?
Okay, good. So it's like there's sort of implied difficulty in every trial, and this one doesn't
It's
have
called
as
a
much.
trial, and the meaning of like a trial is something that's hard to do.
Great point. Yeah. Remy, what were you saying?
Just thinking about it, and depending on the trial, I don't know, like, how difficult it is, but it's a little difficult. I imagine like there's less speed bumps for them to go over in a sense.
Yeah.
To get to the end of the trial,
Mhm.
it's like more difficult ones that have more speed bumps, so you have to like work slow and sort of push the
Yes. So let me ask you this. Do you think a trial that is easy would be more satisfying to let's think of the victims? Or do you think a trial that has lots of speed bumps that is more difficult would be more satisfying to the victims? It's an interesting idea to me because you have to put yourself in place of someone who has been victimized, right? And you think about if it just went off without a hitch, I think that would be less satisfying. It would feel like there was less redemption there. And part of that might be because it was like, it was so obviously wrong. Why did this thing happen to me? Like, this feels so awful. But I'm thinking about a trial that's like a long, arduous trial. It feels like that's the way it should be, because we even name it that. I kind of want, if you get redemption at the end of a long, arduous trial, like you might start to feel like, okay, now I've also put this criminal through something, and I feel like the world is on my side now through this long trial. Maybe that's wrong, but I think that part of the reason it says it passed off without any great difficulty in mind is because it's trying to say, like, there should be difficulty there. There should be speed bumps. Like judging somebody's like criminality and what to do with them should be something that we don't take lightly. But this one seemed to pass off without a hitch. It was fine, no problems. He just confessed everything, and then we can give him his punishment. So there seems to be something absent there rather than something that they're celebrating in the ease of the trial. That makes sense? Okay. Yeah, Kaylin, then to Ben.
It's also the fact that there aren't really victims who are alive
Yes.
to find, I suppose, redemption, because he killed the old lady, he killed her sister, so she can't like get anything from this. Or,
That's a
like,
great point.
Nor like avenge. The old lady wasn't well liked, and
They don't mention family members other than
the sister,
Elizabetta, yeah.
I mean, like, and their family is probably dead because they're old.
Yeah.
And it's just kind of like there was no redemption for the victims. It was just Raskolnikov saying he was guilty, and
Good.
people were just kind of like, oh, okay, well,
Good.
that's good.
Yeah, so it kind of feels like it went through the motions because there wasn't this idea that you have to have satisfaction for the victim. It's only the idea that we need to be protected from the criminals, or for some reason the criminals need to be punished for what they've done, according to legal rules. Ben?
Well, she kind of said what I was going to say, but kind of adding to it, the only true victim is Elizabetta, because Raskolnikov intended to kill the pawnbroker, not her sister. But also adding on to it, at least my translation says he did not confuse or misinterpret the facts nor soften them in his own interest. So maybe the reason why the trial went so quickly is because he had no remorse for it. He wasn't trying to hide.
Yeah, excellent. The fact that he's not fighting it feels like he also just then didn't have any remorse for the actions too, and was just like, well, here's what I did. You're going to do what you do. Yes, I like that a lot. And he maybe thinks that the only victim is really Elizabetta. Is that what you're saying? Because we think that the pawnbroker was a victim too, because he killed her. I don't know if the book thinks that she was, but it definitely thinks Elizabetta was. Okay. All right, so he's talking about all of the details. It skipped down. Mine says, in a word, everything was made perfectly clear. So it's like they have kind of step by step made the process of the crime completely rational and logical. The examining magistrates and judges found it surprising, among other things, that he had hidden the purse and other property under the stone without making any use of them, and were most astonished of all that not only did he not remember all of the details of the objects he himself had stolen, but he was even uncertain of their number. In particular, the circumstance that he had never once opened the purse and did not know exactly how much it contained seemed incredible. There were in fact 370 rubles and 60 kopecks in it. From long lying under the stone, some of the biggest notes at the top had almost perished. All right, so why does it mention this part? Like all of this stuff about how they're so astonished by the fact that he didn't steal the money. Sydney?
I think it kind of shows that stealing all the stuff really wasn't his motive. Like, if you're gonna steal the stuff, you would like count it, see how much you got, what was your loot. But
Yeah.
he didn't do any of that. He just hid it away. So that obviously was.
Yeah, and they say it seemed incredible then that he had done this thing, because if he didn't want the money, what did he want? And suddenly they're very confused about this. Sammy?
I think it's kind of showing how astonished they are about how haphazard he was about.
Yes. Okay, so like the fact that he seems to be so clear in his description of what happened, and yet when he's talking about what happened to the money, it's haphazard. So there's this like real juxtaposition between those things, I think. So they're like, it seems incredible. And in their minds, they think this is the reason that you would commit this crime, is to rob her. Why else would you kill some random old woman? It would be to rob her. And he's not fitting into that definition of what they think a criminal should be, and that's upsetting them. They spent a long time trying to discover why the accused should be lying in this one particular, when he so freely and accurately acknowledged his guilt in any other respect. So rather than like thinking about the facts and the facts that he is like actually telling the truth, they're like, oh, he must be lying about the robbery part. Why would he? In the end, some of them, especially some who were psychologists, even admitted the possibility that he really did not know what was in the purse because he had hidden it under the stone without looking inside it. But from this, they concluded that the crime itself could have been committed only in a state of temporary mental derangement, so to speak, as a result of homicidal mania expressed in murder and robbery for their own sakes without motive or calculation. So, what tone do you think, and this is in your translations too, what tone does the book take towards this ruling that he was insane? Audrey?
Seems kind of like clinical.
Yes, what makes it feel clinical?
Like the words temporary mental derangement are in my translation too, and homicidal mania. That's like, it feels very like hospital.
Yeah, okay, good. So it feels like, okay, your confession was very clear, and now we're going to assign this hospital diagnosis to the confession that you made. All right, cool. It does feel like the book is maybe mocking or disparaging that ruling. What makes it feel like it's taking like a mocking tone towards the idea that he's insane? Yeah, Race.
My translation says this fell in with the most recent fashionable theory of temporary insanity.
Yes. Yes, why does calling it a fashionable theory mean that it's not like legitimate? Audrey?
Like fashionable things that are fashionable are in for a while and then they go out. So it's kind of just like this is what's popular to say right now. So they're like, no, it's just what they want to say.
It's not.
Big fit.
It's not truth. It's just it's temporary, sort of what fits with society. Christiane, what were you saying? Oh, okay. Yeah.
I think temporary insanity can actually be a thing, but I think it more plays along to like the mental issues of the person. Like Raskolnikov shows that he has a hard time controlling his impulses, and so that could be used to be like, well, he clearly has some mental things going on, and he clearly regrets it, and it was just kind of a moment of insane.
Yeah, but do they base the ruling of insanity on his sense of regret? What are they basing it on?
Oh, I think they're basing it off of the fact that he was like a good person, like that he had saved all these people, and the fact that he had done that clearly showed that he was a good person.
I think that if the book was telling us that that's what they base it on, I would be okay with the temporary insanity ruling. I'd be like, oh, okay, yeah, he's inconsistent. Somehow this is temporary insanity, but I think they're basing the ruling on something else. Christiane?
I think it's based on the fact that he never really had a motive.
Yeah, exactly. And they're especially upset about the fact that he didn't rob her. If he would have robbed her, they would have said, okay, he's guilty of murder. But the fact that he didn't rob her, they're saying, oh, okay, so he was insane. Because it doesn't fit in with what our definition of what a murderer is. Like a murderer does it for the money. And if he doesn't have that motivation, then he must be crazy. Do you guys know how someone actually gets away with? That sounds awful, but it's a ruling of insanity. I forgot what the name of it is, but there was a case where they established it after this book was written. It was like in the early 1900s, and it is based on if the criminal does not know if what he did was right or wrong. So like if the criminal is still thinking like that, that what he did was perfectly fine, and in the moment had no sense that what he was doing was wrong, then he can get a temporary insanity ruling. Sammy?
Like also, like in the moment, or like at the time of the ruling, he still feels like he did it righteously.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. That's, I mean, a huge part of it. I mean, obviously, like if somebody is up there and they're talking about how it was like such a good thing to kill them and they seem like retributive, is that a word? They seem vengeful, then that's not going to apply. But they have to be out of their mind enough where they don't know what they're doing is wrong to get that ruling. And that doesn't seem to be what they are basing it on here. They seem to be just basing it on the fact that there wasn't economic reasons for killing her. You weren't a good capitalist, so you're going to, you were insane. What about the idea? So the fashionable theory, I think this is like temporary. It's like a word, it's like saying trendy. It was a trendy theory. Sammy?
For the economic motives, I think that could also be kind of
Dostoevsky.
Kind of critiquing capitalism in a way. So I looked it up, and because there was like one chunk of the book where I think Porphyry and Razumihin were like fighting about like capitalism versus socialism, and I think the author was a socialist, and so I think the fact that he's like pointing out, oh, he's insane because he wasn't in it for capitalism and that's wrong.
Yeah.
Kind of points out kind of how we.
Yeah, I think it's just like a little dig at it here. I don't think this book is all about capitalism and socialism, but yeah, Dostoevsky was a socialist. In fact, he went to prison for being a socialist. He went to a gulag for 7 years, I want to say. I want to say it was the same as Raskolnikov, but it was because he was involved in like a communist group.
No wonder he knew so much about it.
Yeah, right. He was it was right before, this is like 30 years before that first Russian Revolution. So he was kind of like he was an early adapter. Yeah.
I was like, when I was first reading it, and there was that conversation that we talked about the other day between those two dudes that were like, well, if we kill one guy for the greater good, it's like kind of socialist, like let's kill Jeff Bezos and then the rest of us can have his money.
Yeah, redistribute that money and then we are good. That's such a socialist concept. So it's interesting. He's critiquing it there though, right? He's like saying like, this is not a moral way to do this. So yeah, he wasn't full-blown revolutionary. And in fact, I think towards the end of his life, he started to feel more religious and more traditional in his beliefs, but yeah. Okay, so let's keep going. Happily, which coincided happily with the latest fashionable theory. So it's totally mocking that idea that he was insane, which our contemporaries so often try to apply to various criminals. Again, mocking that way of doing legal justice. Then skip ahead and it says, to the extreme annoyance of those who upheld this opinion, the criminal hardly tried to defend himself. To the crucial questions, what had made him commit murder and what had prompted him to rob, he replied plainly with the bluntest accuracy that the motive of the whole thing lay in his wretched position, his poverty and helplessness, his desire to furnish for the first steps of his career the security of the 3,000 rubles, at least that he counted on finding in his victim's possession. So what is Raskolnikov saying his motive was? Yeah, so he's saying that the motive is the money. So you can believe me or not, but the motive was the money. But they're like, it couldn't have been because you didn't even count the money. And says his resolve to murder was the consequence of his unstable and cowardly nature, which was moreover exasperated by privation and failure. When he was asked what had induced him to voluntary confession, he answered that it was sincere remorse. All this was said almost callously. Remy?
And one of the, like, just really want to skip over, when it said that he said his motive was because he was poor and helpless. Earlier, at least in my translation, it says, Raskolnikov's hypochondriacal condition was proved by many witnesses. And right at the beginning of the book, I ended up defining it, and it said it's anxiety about health.
Yeah.
And so he's worried about his own health, and so that is his motive, is that he's trying to help himself.
Got it. So like the fact that they're saying that the fact that he's so worried about his own health, or he's saying that his own worry
Yeah.
about his own health is what causes
Is
him
what
to
caused
commit the murder. Yeah. And yet, ironically, the murder is what completely undercuts his own health. Yeah, for sure. What do you guys think about this last part where it says he answered that it was sincere remorse was the reason that he confessed? All of this was said almost callously, ... Sydney?
It's like, he's not telling the truth there because he, like towards the end of the book and still in that one, he keeps saying how he still feels justified in killing her. He still thinks he did the right thing, so he wasn't remorseful at all.
Right. If he's like sitting there and making all of these excuses for why he did it, but then ultimately he's still thinking like it was fine that I did this thing, it's just that I wasn't a great man, then he's not feeling that sincere remorse. So he is lying to the court, just straight up lying. I confessed out of sheer remorse. Why did he confess then if it wasn't remorse? Ben?
I think this whole novel is interesting because it talks about how Raskolnikov during the beginning he didn't really have much choice over his life. So he decided to kind of exert his like free will and agency onto other people by killing the pawnbroker. But it's interesting how it plays out because despite that, he made a choice which was his own, and then it led to him getting in contact with Boy Fury, and then kind of saying he was guilty of it. But it's interesting because previously before the start of the novel, he didn't have any choice, but now he does. And this is kind of what he does with it, rather than just leave it up to the
Good. Yeah. So at the beginning, he's wandering around feeling a lot of anxiety about how he can make this choice in his life. In the middle, again, he's sort of like forced into that state of wandering around feverishly, feeling like he's not in control of his own life. So the confession itself is him reasserting that free will and saying, no, I do have a choice. I can choose to confess.
Well, I think it's interesting because he imposes his own choices, even though that's what previously the world has kind of been doing to him. So the fact that he makes that choice and he just kind of wants control over his own path is why I think in part it makes him confess.
Oh, okay. So him actually exerting his free will takes away that choice in the end because it's leading him to confess and he doesn't really have a choice about the confession itself.
Yeah.
Okay, I get that. So it's another way that it's like super ironic that the one time he makes the choice for himself through his own powers of reason, he gets exactly the opposite of what he wanted. Yeah, Remy.
And, to go along with Ben's point, we just, as humans, naturally tend to overthink things a whole lot, and when we overthink it, then we make it too complicated, and we go further than what we should have gone. Like we go past the answer, and then we have to like backtrack to get to the answer, and so there's just like a certain point I think that everybody can handle like a secret or whatnot, right? And I think Raskolnikov might have just like his breaking point is just like I'm done trying to keep it in, and I hear all these people talking about it and they're speculating, and but I just want it all to be over, so I'll confess.
Okay, good. So it's like that. It's almost like that question of isolation, that human beings can only handle a certain amount of isolation before they have to communicate what is inside them. And so he is pushed to that point and doesn't really have a choice about the confession, which is not sincere remorse, is what you guys are both saying. Okay, Kale?
I have to agree with the lack of sincere remorse. He does still view his extraordinary as ordinary. I do think the ultimate reason why he confesses is because so needs right there.
Yeah.
because we see him go up to the police station and he's gonna confess, and then he's just kind of there. And he's kind of like, and then he goes back downstairs, and there's Sonia, and he's kind of like, okay, yeah, no, I gotta do this. And then he ultimately does it, I think, for her because she's
Yeah.
watching it.
Okay, so then it might be out of a kind of love.
Or maybe just sort of like, Sonia is probably the best person that that's why he goes and asks her to like bless him. He follows her advice and like worshiping the ground, and he's just sort of like, well, if she thinks I need to do this, then I
So it's
should."
putting that choice entirely into somebody else's hands then.
Mhm.
Okay, so it's not about like his feverish state leading him there, or like it being sort of over the top, like I'm just too full of thoughts and ideas and guilt and so on, so I need to like actually state it out. It's like this worship of Sonia.
Or it's just sort of like, well, where he's
The
under her
moment.
influence.
Okay, cool. Sammy and then Todd.
I think his relationship with Sonia though is almost like a kind of similar to like a high school relationship that shows a little bit of like maturity.
Yeah.
So still like you're still in that like young kind of young love kind of state where it's like you will do stuff like for them. Like
Yeah.
like he scheduled his all his classes around his girlfriend and then like
It's a codependency.
yeah.
Yeah, maybe not codependent. Well, yeah, I think Sonia's got some codependency problems too. I mean, she is following a murderer to the gulag. So yeah, there's a kind of immaturity. Let's say, I'm not sure if this book feels like it's immature or if it feels like it's great to be dependent on others. So let's stick with that word of dependency. Yeah, Audrey.
I wouldn't say that he confessed seeing Sonia like out of love. I think it's just like, oh, there's someone here to hold me accountable for my own actions other than me.
So she's
So
mom.
She's kind of like mom.
Yeah.
It's kind of like, oh, it's not just me who has my secret anymore. Now I actually have to confess. Dang, I can't just write it off because like I do stuff like that where it's like no one's gonna hold me accountable. I don't have to do it. Like I don't have to. I don't have to read my book or do this if nobody's there to hold me accountable. Like I can just play on my phone or whatever. But like if I'm downstairs with my family, I'm like, oh, I can't just sit here on my phone and not do my homework when my dad's right there because they'll make fun of me.
Okay, good. So it still is what Sammy's talking about with this kind of like immaturity and dependence, but it's more what Kale was talking about. Because I don't think that Sonia is going to confess for him. Like I don't think Sonia's going to tell on him. But it's this kind of like looking up to her as a moral authority that, oh, I better do what she wants because I see her as being, morally better than me. Enoch?
I find Sonia's like probably weird. That she's like a prostitute and then she's like super attracted to some prostitute.
Yeah.
Like it seems like a really weird relationship.
Yeah. Right, because Raskolnikov is a hottie, and they say that a few times, right? But it can't only be that, right? So what is the answer to that? That goes down a little bit of a different track, but I find that really interesting too and weird. Why do you think Sonia, I get why Raskolnikov likes Sonia, but why does Sonia like Raskolnikov?
Okay, it kind of feels like during that whole book, Sonia is using prostitution as a way to earn money for her family, and her family relies on it. And then then comes Raskolnikov, who basically doesn't care that she's her family and just tries to bring her down to his level. And maybe that was sort of like, maybe she wanted that, like her father who wanted to be punished.
Okay.
His thing, maybe she wanted someone to acknowledge that, hey, what she was doing wasn't right to her, and she was just sort of in this situation.
So it's the way that he recognizes her immorality that she likes, that kind of recognition that both of us are here at the bottom.
And
Yeah.
maybe she felt that connection. Raskolnikov was attempting to bring her down. It worked.
Okay, so maybe it's a bit of self-hatred on Sonia's part then. Do we have any other reasons that Sonia and yes and
I think that since she is earning all the money for her family, she's working so hard and there's so much stress put on her. Sometimes when you're like so stressed out like that, you would just like go for the first thing. And Raskolnikov was kind of like that first thing. So interesting. She's a prostitute, so she'd be with a whole bunch of people who don't care about her, don't care what's going on in her life. But then Raskolnikov actually
shows some concern in talking to her, so then she's like, oh, this is kind of nice.
It's really interesting because, you know, with her job, she offers something physical to the men that she is with, and they give her money, right? But there is also a kind of emotional labor that she is doing in that job too. I offer something emotional, and then you give me money. Raskolnikov comes to her almost with that same expectation, like, I'm going to come to you, I'm going to just confess all my sins. That's a huge burden. Like, don't do that to me. If one of you have murdered someone, please don't tell me. Keep that to yourself, because that's such a huge burden on her, right? But I think what's interesting is that he doesn't give her anything in return. He doesn't have money to give her. He doesn't really have love to give her, even for quite a while. Like, he's a jerk to her. He's like, your God isn't real, you know, like he's just trying to like bring her down. Maybe there's something satisfying about that part of it, that she gets to sacrifice, and it's not this transaction. She does seem to be somebody who likes to sacrifice, who sees sacrifice and suffering as a positive quality. And even though it's like bringing her, like she feels physical pain from that, it's like, oh, I'm getting closer to God through this physical pain. So maybe there is something about the lack of transaction that appeals to her about Raskolnikov, like full sacrifice. Without any of the benefits. Asher, what were you saying?
I wonder if it's also possible she just has a thing for having to be the one to save people.
Right.
Because like when her dad died, she was the one. He died in her arms, and she did that on purpose.
Mm-hmm.
And then she defended her stepmom, even though it might have gone better had she not defended her for her siblings.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So her sense of personal responsibility. We could think about the way that gives her a feeling of control over her life when she doesn't have many areas for control, living in poverty as she does. And so being the savior, being the person to like help someone else can be empowering. He's like the bad boy, the bad boy trope, where the good girl gets with the bad boy because she can change him. And when he changes, that means that the good girl was in power all along. And it wasn't actually the bad boy, That's a weird way of putting Raskolnikov. I've never thought of him as that bad boy trope, but he kind of is a little bit. He is a little bit like John Travolta in Grease. But instead of Sonia dressing up in the leather, she's making John Travolta dress up in the preppy clothes. Yeah.
I also think it's kind of like her trying to, in a way, like re-victimize herself,
Mm-hmm.
because like a lot of her life, like people have just been like taking her, it's like, you suck, Sonia, or whatever. Then she's like, oh, Raskolnikov makes fun of me too. That's nice.
Okay, so it's a little bit what Kale was saying too, like she wants to feel that kind of suffering. Yeah. But I mean, either way all the ways that we're framing this, it's still weird. But I think we can start to like think about her mind state. Yeah, Sammy.
For suffering, I think for her, it could just be something she feels she needs because of like the Orthodox Catholics.
Yes.
Believe in needing to suffer for salvation.
Yes. Yes, it's like a self-flagellation, right? And there are even some extreme radical churches where it's like they have whips with barbs on them that they are, praying and whipping themselves, and it's like supposed to put you in the same mindset. I don't actually know I don't have the full. It's Da Vinci Code, exactly. It's supposed to put you in this mindset of like what Jesus felt. So like feel the pain for your sins so that you can be closer to Christ, closer to God. So that could be it too. Raskolnikov is not there yet. I want to get back to this passage. Does yours have the ... after callously?
Yeah.
No.
Even in my weird translation,
It
say
does in
callously, it
yours.
says
Some of yours doesn't.
there's a ...
I think the ... is good. If you don't have a ... I don't like that. I like the ... It's all over my book. There are so many of these ... and I am not calling it an ellipses because mine isn't an ellipses. It's got spaces between the periods. So there's a difference between an omission and an ellipses. Ellipses is the one that says like, ugh, it's been a long day. And it's like this long pause, like, ugh. you know, and it signals that's an ellipses. An omission is, I went to the bank with a gun. Gee, I have a lot of money now.
I wonder why that is.
Exactly. It's the yada 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 of the if you've seen Seinfeld, that reference is so dated now, but it's like something is missing there. There's information missing. And at the end of when it says callously in my paragraph, it's got this omission. It says callously. It was almost callously dot spaced out like that. What do we make of that choice? I think that's a super interesting choice in the translation. Sammy?
I'm saying we could kind of draw this book a little to like Seinfeld, because Seinfeld's essentially 4 really bad people who all think they're great people. And
Yeah, and we're all justifying their bad decision.
because they're funny.
Yeah, it's like the pawnbroker is George's fiance that dies from licking stamps, and Susan, and everybody's just like, oh, it's fine. The world's better off without Susan.
Technically, that was George's fault. So.
Okay, so people have called that show nihilist. So I think that it does kind of fit here when we're trying to figure out if it's existentialist, because those two things are so close. But why put the ... after callously? It's not a long pause, it's an omission. What does that mean? All this was said almost callously. ... Yeah, Sammy?
I think it's like purposely trying to leave stuff out.
Yes. What is it leaving out there? It switches to the sentence, however, was more merciful than might have been expected in view of the nature of the crime. I think it's leaving out a state of mind. I think it's leaving out what's going on inside his head, right? These things were said, this confession was said almost callously. Omission. And we can't know what is exactly inside of his head. So when we're looking at law, this is what happened with the courts, and he gets this short sentence of 7 years. 7 years for killing 2 people who it was premeditated. We usually see that motivation as far worse. It didn't seem to be for money, so it was out of like a kind of crazy passionate state, which we usually are like skeptical of. Like, he's not kept off the streets that long. I would not be happy with Raskolnikov coming back to my neighborhood after 7 years, right? Like, I'm gonna be living in the same house, and now he's gonna be living next door again. Like, it's not keeping people safe. Satisfaction for the victims. We mentioned that there are no victims. So what does this book think of the system of law for justice? Yeah,
I think it's kind of making fun of it
I think so.
because we often, like you said, we judge them more harshly, but there's a lot more that goes into a crime that is at first seen. Like, I feel like Raskolnikov's punishment was about right for someone of his mental capacity.
Yeah.
And I think especially at this time period when they probably didn't know a lot about it, it was just kind of like, hey, maybe you're doing it all horribly wrong.
Okay, cool. So it's like maybe they ended up with the right conclusion, but for all the complete wrong reasons, they don't seem to have a handle on why he actually did the thing. They don't have a handle on his real psychology. They don't really understand whether or not he's going to be, safe, or that the community is going to be safer without him. They're just sort of going through the motion. So to start it out by saying that the trial was easy, that's a way of saying it was not that great. Not that great of a way to get justice.
Back to the omission, like, they admitted what he was thinking, but throughout the entire book, we get what he is thinking. As like,
Yes. And this is the one place where it's not going to tell us.
yeah, and so this is that much more like stress that they omitted it, because Dostoevsky has been explaining what has been going on in Raskolnikov's mind for the entire book.
Right.
But this one part he doesn't, and so it makes it that much more like impactful to us.
Right. It's like 600 pages of what's going on inside his head. But then when we're trying to decide if he feels guilty about it in a court of law, we don't get that information. So it's like the court has no access to what really matters when we're thinking about justice. All right. So I think that solves that problem. How about the God problem, though? Let's go to the very last page. The God problem.
It sounds like a math equation.
That's gonna be the title of my next book.
What?
That was really loud, I'm sorry.
But that one math problem, what's the dude with the horn? Who blows it?
Oh.
You got the top stuff, but
Oh,
it's also a math problem, an infinite convergence and a limited surface area.
Oh no, I don't know.
a
The
road
dude-
ride?
No.
That's what I was gonna say, and then I was like, no, it's not math.
In the Bible, and he has a horn, and it's also math. Never mind.
You gotta Google that. You gotta find that out.
It's like
I need to know now.
Because I don't know the Bible and I don't know math. Is it Gabriel?
it might be Gabriel.
Oh, okay.
Because
Gabriel's math related?
according to angel horn pages,
Gabriel's horn, it's full-blown
A
religion.
very reputable source.
uh,
Not blocked by the school. Okay, so it's gotta be real.
Gabriel often appears with his horn, as do other angels. Gabriel's horn is also a mathematical concept, a geometrical figure that has infinite surface area and encloses a finite volume. And angel's trumpet is a very pretty, albeit poisonous member of the Dontoro plant family.
Fascinating. See, this is why I gotta find out more about the Bible.
Not really.
So full of interesting stuff.
It's
Everything I've learned about it's been real.
It's like you take the graph of log x, and rotate it around the x-axis, and find the volume that's finite, but also the surface area is infinite.
Fascinating. That's so fascinating. Okay, all right. But a little off topic, right?
Yeah.
Okay. I didn't know if you were gonna, that was a genuine question. I didn't know if you were gonna apply it. Okay. All right, so last couple pages of the epilogue. Sonia got sick and he realized, oh, I kind of like her. It's like the most annoying part of this book to me is that, yeah, she's not showing up and he's like, oh, I've kind of taken this woman for granted. I really do like her in my life. So she comes back. She
I thought
wasn't,
that was great.
Shorty's kind of.
it's nice, but like, what a jerk to not know that already.
That's because he
Yeah.
was taking it for granted.
Exactly,
That's why-
exactly.
When she goes away, he's like, oh wait, no, yeah. It's that realization and that want to change for her that is so cool.
Yeah, no, you're right. You're right.
Crazy. It's so
Okay.
romantic.
So she stretches out her hand to him timidly, sometimes even half withdrawing it as if she feared he would repulse her. He always grasped it reluctantly, always greeted her with a kind of irritation, sometimes remained obstinately silent all through her visits. This is before she's sick. There had been occasions when she had quailed before him and gone away deeply hurt, but this time their hands remained joined. He gave her a rapid glance but said nothing and turned his eyes to the ground. They were alone. There was nobody to see them. The guard had turned away. Remy, what are you saying?
Just looking, just comparing the text to text or whatever. The way that that we described how like Raskolnikov like finally realizes like he's been taking Sonia for granted or whatever, kind of reminds me of in Les Mis with Jean Valjean. He has interest in this one girl and doesn't notice this other girl that has interest in him until that girl dies, and he's like, oh wait.
Oh, you
I
mean
like
not Jean Valjean?
Oh,
Maurice,
Maurice,
the
yeah.
kid. Yeah.
right. And so yeah.
Right. So Eponine is like completely in love with him there the whole time, but he's like infatuated with this other girl.
Right, yeah.
She literally takes an L. She's like,
kills herself for him.
yeah, she literally dies. She's like, I'm gonna cross dress and die for you.
And Eponine has the best song
She has the
too.
best songs too. Like,
And Maurice doesn't even notice that she has the best songs. Like altos are way better than sopranos.
no, Christian, she's right. I'm sorry.
But yeah, I do think there's that kind of comparison, something being under your nose the whole time, right? And him not, and being just so clueless. And it's always the clueless boy. It's never the clueless girl. The girls in novels, I mean these old fashioned novels, that's sort of the stereotype, the archetype for the girl is that she's kind of long suffering, just waiting for the boy to come around, right? And that does happen right here. So now he's gonna hold her hand, I love that it says his eyes turned to the ground. What is that telling us about how the relationship is changing?
He's like,
He's
school
shy.
child.
He's being scolded a little bit. He's being a little bit shy. He's realizing maybe there's a reason to be shy in the presence of this woman. Sammy? He's a little embarrassed about his past actions. I think it's a sign of humility. And all of these things are about humility, right? Turning his eyes to the ground instead of being bold enough to look her straight in the eye and feel like we are equals. He's suddenly like, ooh, actually, I don't know that we are equals. And it says how it happened, he himself did not know, but suddenly he seemed to be seized and cast at her feet. He clasped her knees and wept. For a moment, she was terribly frightened and her face grew white.
I was terrified too.
If he suddenly just went down and grasped her knees. So this is an even a greater sign of humility. It also puts her in this position, like you think of just the blocking of it, that she's like now standing before him and he is on his knees in front of her. Where does that place her in terms of like religious understanding?
God.
Yeah, she becomes a kind of God-like figure, and she's a woman, and so she becomes kind of a Mary type figure. Those of you who have your computers out, Google the Pietà. It's Pieta. The Pieta, yeah.
But the true God of the novel is so. That would be an interesting take to do.
Yes, I mean that's kind of where Asher was going from the beginning, right? You find salvation through other people, so.
It's a statue.
Yeah, have you seen the statue?
Oh yeah, we've seen it.
So
It was in a
it's a meme?
Yeah, basically it was like a picture and then like underneath it was like, look at this astounding work done by Michelangelo. And then underneath it's like, yeah, this is really cool, so, especially since he was a turtle.
See, this is what I mean by Gen Z. Trying to have a sacred image of Christianity. It's a comment on the Ninja Turtles. About the Taliban at the gym that I saw the other day? Oh my gosh. So I was telling you guys about how, you're so cynical or whatever. I saw one, I think it was right after that class. It was on TikTok where it was the Taliban that was like working out at the gym in Afghanistan, and it played The Boys Are Back in Town. They're like working out. What is wrong with you? Anyway, we're
It makes me laugh so bad because they had a little like the map of like Saddam Hussein's like cave or whatever, and then it's just like this little red dude that represents Saddam Hussein, and it's the funniest thing to me. I was like, Saddam Hussein.
I don't get it. I don't understand it. I'm gonna have to see it, I think.
Saddam Hussein's a giant.
Okay. You can meme the justice system in this book. You can't the Pietà. This is a serious moment. Here is Raskolnikov falling on the ground, taking responsibility for sins. We see him, maybe comparing him to the Christ-like figure here goes a little bit far because he is a murderer, but it's that sign of responsibility and humility, ultimate humility falling to the ground. And here is Sonia in the Mother Mary position comforting Raskolnikov. Anytime in literature, especially classic literature, that you've got a woman sitting or standing and a man on the ground in her lap, that's a reference to the Pietà. We're going to see it again in King Lear. We see it constantly throughout literature. And here she's put in that position. Yes.
Even if the guy just like he trips in front of her, it's a reference.
If he's crying, sure. Even if he oopsie trips in front of her. In classic literature, it's always, I'm going to say it. And she's terrified to be in that position. Like she's like Enoch was saying, she's a prostitute. She has been in the lowest of the low, right? And yet here is this person who is prostrating himself in front of her. And it says, but in that instance, she understood. Infinite happiness shone in her eyes. She had understood, and she no longer doubted that he loved her forever, and that now at last this moment had come, and mine has another omission. ... Does yours have the omission there? ...
Yeah.
Okay. So what is significant about this instance in terms of the book believing in divinity? Because here we have this image of divinity, but it's putting regular people into the position. Regular people meaning like very clear sinners, And it's saying he loved her, at last that moment had come. ... You have to get to it a little quickly. Yeah, Sam.
Just in hindsight, what Sonia did compared to Raskolnikov isn't that bad.
Mm-hmm.
So like she's seen as like a almost very a saint.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, she's seen as a saint. And then Jesus, I'm pretty sure did like some stuff that like Christian faiths wouldn't approve of.
Mm.
But like I don't know how to explain it.
Okay, so it's a way of pointing out that these people that we see as saints were also human, and signaling, really focusing on their humanity then. But it's also making the human divine. So then do we say that there's a God that exists in this scene? Kale.
Maybe it ties back to the fact that Raskolnikov turned to people rather than God.
Okay.
They were the people. And just sort of like in this moment when he's sort of worshiping Sonia.
Yes.
He's kind of worshiping the people.
Yeah.
And finding comfort in the fact that they are there.
Right. He is not on his knees prostrating himself before God. He is kissing the crossroads in a way that Sonia wanted him to, but it is not in a way to humble himself before God. He is humbling himself before Sonia. And the book isn't saying that Sonia is God, but it is saying that she is Raskolnikov's avenue towards redemption. His salvation.
It's that salvation through others that
Yeah.
she was mentioning.
Yeah, exactly. So let's keep going. They tried to speak, but they could not. Tears stood in their eyes. They were both pale and thin, but in their white, sick faces, there glowed the dawn of a new future, salvation, redemption, right? A perfect resurrection into a new life. It's been talking about Lazarus this whole time. Here is his Lazarus moment. He's rising from the dead. Love had raised them from the dead. Oops, I should have just kept reading. And the heart of each held endless springs of life for the heart of the other. We have heard now, we heard infinite. We have heard endless. We've heard about resurrection and springs of life. This is religious language. It says, they knew they must wait and be patient. They had 7 more years before them, and what unbearable sufferings and infinite happiness those years would hold. But he was restored to life, and he knew it, and felt to the full all his renewed being. And she lived only in his life.
That's beautiful.
Tell me, it is beautiful. So tell me now, just based on that, okay, but wait. Yes, based on that so far, does the book believe in God? Can we know or not know at this point?
I don't think we can. We can imply a lot of things. We could argue for either side. I
Yeah.
think the one thing that you can count on is that people are at the heart of the story.
Oh, I forgot about this. I'm sorry. It's a fake one. So we're gonna go out these stairs over here, go down across the parking lot, and I'm gonna meet you on the grass. Let's pause the recording.